you go. Max is in. I'm here. Hopefully, we're ready. We're ready to we're ready to go. So one of the reasons I chose Max first for this series I'd like to do is he's tech savvy and he's a roll with the flow kind of guy, and you know, he and I will just make it work somehow. So that's why, you know, Max is my co-pioneer on this.
Yeah, and being an adopter of tech, I know that there are, you know, learning curves and glitches that come along with that. So.
You know, and as I thought, you know, I made all my rookie mistakes with the first time around. Well, you know, maybe I still have a couple more to figure out. Anyway, welcome, Max. Let me start that introduction again because I have a feeling some people didn't hear it. Max is one of my expert governance friends who I just happened to stumble upon several years ago and have found kind of a kindred governance spirit. Max is partner and co-founder of LF Leadership, a California-based consulting firm that focuses on providing coaching, facilitation, strategic planning, and a wide range of capacity building services for organizations, not just in the nonprofit sector, but also in the public and private sectors as well, right, Max?
Correct, yeah, but focused on mission-oriented organizations, social impact oriented.
Absolutely. Really great stuff, and he's always traveling somewhere incredibly cool. In addition to all of that work, which he's been doing for about 20 years with different organizations, he's also on the faculty of the Claremont University Master of Social Impact program, which is a new, really wonderful kind of program that if you're interested in nonprofits and interested in NGO work, it's something you really want to check out. He's on the faculty there. He's also, and the reason we're here today, he's also an advanced doctoral student in organizational behavior at Claremont Graduate University School of Behavioral and Organizational Studies. And he's in the midst of some heavy-duty research that is related to his dissertation. And he's at a point where he's kind of interested in maybe sharing a bit and talking aloud and sharing a bit with our audience here a bit more about that work. Max is, I would say, a practitioner with a scholar's heart. Maybe a different way to think about that is a scholar with a practitioner's curiosity, one or the other. Whatever, I'm very, very pleased to bring him to you today. We're going to be talking about his research on shared leadership and strategic decision-making in nonprofit boards. So welcome, Max. Hooray, I'm glad to see you.
Great, likewise, thanks.
I've had the benefit of talking to you over the last few years, and I've had a chance to read a bit of your rationale and your background work. But those watching us haven't had that privilege. So if you wouldn't mind, tell us a bit about what led you down this path of research and kind of where you're focusing your work.
Sure. Well, I mean, in a lot of ways, I see this work as kind of a continuation of, you know, in retrospect, you know, kind of in several interests that I've had for a number of years. And, you know, one is around, you know, how do people go about collaborating together, coming together around, you know, across differences around, you know, shared goals and shared interests. And, you know, and particularly in a lot of my work in, you know, the focus of my consulting work is on leadership development. And, you know, and we do a lot of, we define that, though, not just as kind of developing individual leaders, but developing leadership as an organizational capacity and in a collective capacity. And so that includes things like, you know, team effectiveness, board development, strategic orientation, strategic planning, you know, and really anything that, you know, we've developed our own leadership model that, you know, we look at the kind of the key ingredients of leadership as a collective capacity, which are having a clear sense of direction, having, you know, meaningful conversations to align around that direction, you know, and also aligning resources and efforts, you know, and then creating systems and structures and infrastructure to support action in, you know, in alignment with that direction. And then finally taking action in a way that's conscious and reflective and, you know, and creates feedback loops that then you can become both more effective and, you know, and conscious in how you act. And so, so as we've done work around this, and, particularly, both looking at doing strategic planning and, and often when I'm doing consulting, I see my role as a consultant in strategic planning is really creating spaces for people to have conversations that matter, and, and allowing people to look into kind of their underlying assumptions. And understand each other's underlying assumptions so that they can, ideally come together around common ground, and at the very least understand what the source of those differences is and value that as something that enriches an organization or a board rather than pulling it apart. And so because when those assumptions aren't surfaced and when people are fixed in their assumptions, and don't try to, take other people's perspective and don't try to seek common ground, then things can very often break down, especially when, push comes to shove and you're in a crisis or in a really challenging situation or faced with just a really big decision. And so, so those are kind of the things that brought me to this, is saying, how do people collaborate? How do they bridge differences? How do they create collective leadership? And particularly in boards of directors, how do they align their strategic orientation, strategic, values in such a way that they can lead, the organization forward in a way that encompasses and draws on the richness of that diversity rather than kind of one group, being in a win-lose kind of situation.
Absolutely. Tell me about, I'm not sure we're doing echo. Tell me about how maybe your work as a practitioner, as you know, a lot of people in the sector who study the sector really focus on things like roles and responsibilities and structure and demographics and things. How has your, I really feel that practitioner in you really informing your thinking and your choice of topic. What was compelling to you about needing to really dig deeper into this particular area, particularly board kind of process issues? Sure.
Well, I mean, part of it is, as just sort of my frustration as a reflective practitioner when I, a lot of times when I read a lot of the, on the one hand, a lot of the kind of practitioner-oriented writings and, resources that are out there on boards are very much kind of written from a perspective of here's what the board should do. And it's very much around roles and responsibilities and, kind of on the one hand, the legal responsibilities, which are real, but also don't capture something that you and I have talked about a lot is how board add strategic value to, to the organization, not just kind of play an oversight and controlling role. And so there's a lot of times there's a lot of, I think, kind of finger wagging that goes on at boards, that they're either not doing good job on oversight, or they're not doing a good job of fundraising, or or whatever, but not really looking at how can boards be effective as what we really need them to be, which is leaders of an organization. And board members individually as leaders, and also the board collectively as a leadership team that on the one hand has legal responsibility, but on the other hand is potentially a great asset to kind of bridge from the organization to the broader community. And so there's, on the one hand, on the practitioner side, is frustration with the finger wagging, and on the research side, it's also frustration with the lack of, very often, the nature of academic research is such that, there's the publish or perish imperative, and, and a lot of the research generally in the nonprofit sector has kind of come out of an economic perspective and a sociological perspective, and kind of these macro level concerns about sort of how do organizations behave as entities, rather than, what's the role of individual, really kind of agents in the sense of individual choice and decision making within that. and so often the individuals, it feels like, can you get lost in that conversation, and so it's sort of a, in some ways, kind of the practitioner side sort of fetishizes the agency and ignores the constraints, and the research side focuses so much on the structures and the constraints that it doesn't really acknowledge individuals and their values and hopes and aspirations, and why we're actually, those of us who serve on boards are there.
You bet. Yes. As you can probably imagine, we've kind of bonded over these issues over the years. Let's dig a little deeper into your research question. There are kind of two key components within that. I'd like to have you describe for those watching, because I have a feeling your definition might be not a little bit different than what they might think of when they first hear about that. You're really looking at shared leadership and strategic decision making. Let's define for the audience what you mean by shared leadership, particularly within a nonprofit board. What does that look like?
Sure. Yeah, and shared leadership, it's interesting. I actually just a couple of weeks ago was at the Alliance for Nonprofit Management Conference and presented in a session on research to practice and on shared leadership with John Thomas Brightfield of the Movement Project and Mike Allison, who's a Bay Area consultant. And the first thing we realized as we were planning the session that we had to do was to look at, when we say shared leadership, what do we really mean? Because it's used in a lot of different ways. And normally, I think a lot of times it's used to talk about kind of how leadership is distributed among multiple individuals, structurally. A lot of times people talk about it in terms of having co-CEOs, or in the arts sector, there's often, an artistic director and an executive director, and in other sectors, there's, often in the medical sector, you have a medical director and an administrative director. And you could say that they share leadership, but what I look at in shared leadership is looking at it as a process of how people, in teams share, an influence process to lead one another towards shared goals. And so there's three different kind of dimensions across which that happens. And you can think of it that there's, yes, there's the distribution of who is exercising leadership within a group, or an organization. And so that sort of has to do with both the, formal structures, but really also informal emergence of people as leaders, and sort of leadership as people step up or as others look to them to provide direction and support around alignment and the other things that I talked about, systems and action. And so that's one element. And so that's, the distribution. And you could think of it in terms of kind of, is it really centralized and does everybody look to one person or a couple of people, or is it spread thin and, kind of horizontally throughout the organization? Another dimension is the dimension of different roles or ways of exercising leadership. And so in some cases that could be leadership around, there's different frameworks for thinking about it, ways of thinking about it, but there's, could be leadership around, okay, so one person is the task-oriented person and one person is the, is more of a relationship manager, and another person is more about like mapping out how we actually get stuff done, and something. And so you can think of that different people may play those roles, either multiple people playing one role, or those roles distributed among several people, or and so that's another dimension. And then the third dimension is that there can be times when one person steps up, as a lead, and hearing a little bit about audio back is one person per step up is one of the specific roles generally, and then trying the process in terms of you are in a decision process, or whether you are in a project cycle, somebody else may step forward to take leadership, because there are more positions relative to what's needed by the group and order to move that process forward. So, so there's kind of a turn taking, kind of passing the baton back and forth. Sometimes multiple people carrying the baton, sometimes other people carrying the baton. And so it's a very complex, dynamic type of thing. And so if we look at it in terms of boards, then it's, a lot of times we think of it as sort of, board rooms as these very formal, structured types of environments where you've got an agenda and you've got the chair who's like, kind of leading things through it, and the, kind of the extreme example would be the, Robert's rules where everything is very formalized. But in reality, there's a lot of leadership that goes on outside of the boardroom. There's a lot of, dynamics that go on, and especially when you're really having the important strategic conversations, it may be that, around different either conversations or, different topics or aspects of a, of a strategic issue, different people take leadership. And so it may be that one person is the voice of leadership or provides some leadership around the financial aspect of a question. Someone else is, very, like they have a very strong connection. Their family was, was one of the founding families of the organization. And so they've got a very strong kind of connection to the history, and other people have a strong connection to specific stakeholder groups, and others are kind of key donors or cued into what donors want, or, other, partners or whatever, and so in a board conversation, it may be different, those different voices need to be heard at different times in order to weigh all the different aspects of, of a strategic question, which by its nature is, very complex and ambiguous and multifaceted, and, and ultimately kind of values driven, with no objective correct or incorrect answer. It's really more of a value judgment.
As you talk about that, it strikes me, a couple things strike me. One being, you're really talking about a richer, more effective way of using the expertise and the wisdom in the room. And you're also describing, from a board member's perspective, a much more motivating and leadership inspiring kind of environment where these smart people would want to work.
Yes. Yeah. And you're really drawing on the, the smarts and the knowledge and the, the expertise, and also the, not just expertise and knowledge, but really the, the connections and the heart of the, the people who are there in the room to make meaningful, meaningful decisions that are going to affect the future of the organization.
Absolutely. You really more of a holistic approach to thinking about the human resources you have available to you, definitely. Let's talk about the other kind of core component of your research question, which is strategic decision making. And tell me, first off, kind of let's not err on the side of assuming everyone knows what you mean, but let's have you define what that means and what kind of, in a nutshell, what that might look like in a board setting. And then let's talk a bit about how the shared leadership kind of environment, the culture you just described, really positions a board potentially to make the most of those decision-making processes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, as I kind of mentioned earlier, that strategic decisions, as I see it, are questions that are, of major importance to an organization that often, imply that you're going to make a decision that's really hard to take back or to do a redo on. That once you commit to a path, it's, whether you're going to, kind of start a new program, end a program, create a new program site, things like that are require some, commitment of resources. Things like even, which executive director do you hire, when you're searching for a new ED, questions of, when we have different stakeholder groups who want different things, how do we reconcile those differences? If our, donors want one thing, but what we really know that our, people that we serve need is something else, how do we balance that and reconcile that? so for me, that's what a strategic decision is. And there's, the process of making decisions around that involves kind of, on the one hand, sort of this process of taking in information and trying to filter it, because, by its nature, being on a board, you are generally not a subject matter expert in the work of the organization. There's some aspects perhaps that people may be an expert in, but the professionals like the CEO and the other staff are the ones who really kind of have the the most in-depth, it's their day job, and so they know really what's going on the ground. But what you want then from a board and board member is really kind of an outsider's perspective and an informed perspective, and connections to other stakeholders, and a basis of knowledge and expertise and outside perspective. And so so if you're dealing with one of these kind of sticky, complex questions that the organization needs to make a decision around, then it involves both kind of collecting information in order to help make that decision, because often you are working in an environment where information is scarce, or especially for a board member, you may be dependent on information you're getting from the CEO, or you have your own kind of narrow slice of, kind of your professional network, where you may be seeing some of what's going on in the organization's field, but other people may be seeing something else. And so you've got, on the one hand, you want to bring that information to the table, and then on the other hand, you want to figure out how do you make sense of that information. So you first filter out what's relevant and what's not relevant, and then you figure out, okay, so how do we interpret this information? And then based on that interpretation, how do we apply different values? How is that information relative, and relevant to different organizational values that we may hold? So if we hold a value of, on the one hand, accountability, and on the other hand, social equity, how do we reconcile those? Or if we are, in our strategic direction, we are, one person on the board may think that, we need to be trying to expand into new areas, and another person may think that we need to kind of pull back and hunker down and get more efficient and more, operations tighter on the things that we're already doing, rather than kind of building out more overhead. Then, you've got those different competing values that you need to reconcile. And, and the nature of board work is such that really, at least on a formal level, these decisions are ones that can only be made by the board as a collective, not by an individual, or, in practice, sometimes it's an individual or a cabal that kind of does it, whether it's the executive committee or kind of the, sort of an insider group that doesn't have as much engagement with the other board members. But at least in a, ideal situation, the reason why you have people on the board is because they bring some knowledge and perspective and expertise, and relationship to the board. So, and so then the question becomes, how do you go about reconciling those, those differing pieces of information and those differing interpretations of that information, so that it doesn't become just a political question of who's got the loudest voice, or who's got, kind of most influential, or has the most weight to throw around, or whatever, or is most in the inside, decision-making group and not on the fringe, that kind of thing.
Gotcha. Which kind of provides a perfect entree into a topic I wanted to get you to explore a little bit for us, which is the role of cognitive diversity. Mm-hmm. Tell us what that means. We talk about diversity, and we respect the role of diversity. You are kind of expanding that definition a little bit in some interesting ways. Tell us about cognitive diversity and how that kind of feeds into the process you just described.
Mm-hmm. So cognitive diversity really is is basically thinking differently. Ultimately, there's a lot of different kind of ways in which that, that can be broken down, and different ways of, thinking about how people think. but at its basis, it's about people coming with different ways of thinking about a subject, and and so in the board context, there's different ways, and in my research that I'm preparing to do right now for my dissertation, the one that I'm just to keep things simple that I'm probably going to focus on is that point that I mentioned about whether people think you should kind of be more oriented towards innovation and expansion and kind of exploration of the the environment as an organization, and whether the organization should try to create new programs and services and kind of respond proactively to what's going on around it. Whether that's the kind of the funding environment or the service environment, and versus being more oriented towards kind of efficiency and accountability and kind of operational effectiveness, and and sort of more kind of conservative in orientation. And really, if you think about it, organizations need to be able to do both and need to be able to flex. And it may be that in some times or in some areas they need to be more exploratory, and in other places they need to be more kind of conservative and cautious and aware of risk. And so it's not an either or. And really, in order to make a good decision about any given strategic question, you need to look at both of those phases. And so that's a very simplistic kind of breakdown, of at least one dimension of cognitive diversity. And so different board members may come to the board with, some that are naturally a little bit more oriented either because of their own professional background or their, and the lens that they bring from that, kind of the stereotypical, accountant who wants to be, kind of very, cautious about fiduciary issues and so on, versus a person who's, maybe more of a dreamer and thinks that, well, we should be, thinking be outside the box and that kind of thing. And so people come with my assumption that I'm basing this on, which, may or may not be, necessarily the case, is that people have even though people may hold, an awareness that you need both, the exploration and, and kind of consolidation perspectives, they tend more towards one and the other. And that when you look at it as a board, then there's, what you want to do is be able to draw on both of those perspectives to make a good decision. And so what that does is that sort of understanding of cognitive diversity, in my view, actually, a lot of times when we're talking about demographic diversity in boards, there's often a fixation on either demographic diversity or professional diversity in boards. And so you've got the, kind of the board recruitment matrix that you're checking off different boxes in professions or, ethnic and racial. That's important. You want to, there's both a kind of a moral and a, ethical and a practical, kind of obligation to be aware of racial equity and other, and gender, and so on, and so on, so, demographic. And, on the one hand, it's a way to kind of force the organization to be connected to its, its community and to try to reflect and be, responsible. And also, though a lot of times it's sort of confounded with and kind of lumped in together with, well, we want this professional diversity because, because we want, really when we say we want professional diversity, part of what we're saying is we want cognitive diversity about how to think about problems, not just that they bring an accounting skill set or they bring a marketing skill set or whatever. And so, so in a lot of times, and this is also kind of born out of my frustration, and I think not just my own, but reading really 35 of strategic leadership research. There have been all these repeated calls, some progress, but not a lot, kind of getting outside graphic because demographic is easy to get, honestly, then inside the heads. So a lot of times that demographic data, especially the research on strategic leadership is really kind of a proxy for what's really going on in the workplace. And there are down identification and social identity and so on, but then there's also an element of really kind of having different life experience, having different perspectives, different orientations, and so for me, it's trying to get inside that black box.
I'm waiting for this particular piece of your research, because I think this is really kind of a key missing component of thinking about the capacities we need in the boardroom. So I'm very excited to know that you're following up on that. And this is a focal point of your research. It also strikes me that it's not just having those different capacities in the room, but there's also a leadership component of board chairs, committee chairs, others, creating a culture where that's not just respected or tolerated, but really put to good use. Mm-hmm. Let's talk a bit about you kind of point out within the roles of the CEO and the board chair. How do you see them really contributing to facilitating, kind of helping to shape from a positional perspective, mm-hmm. The kind of discussions and the kinds of thinking that we want to see?
Sure. So, one of the things that I think is really interesting about boards is that really it's sort of kind of double shared leadership in a way. And so it's like shared leadership in terms of the board members, kind of years of volunteers. But on the other hand, there's shared leadership, at least, some degree of shared leadership. It all, in practice, again, it varies greatly, between the CEO and the chair. And, and what we've seen, I think, in a number of different, research studies, and what tells us, our common sense tells us in our own experience, is that when you've got a really good partnership and alliance between the CEO and the chair, you can really draw the best out of the board. When you have one or the other that's more dominant, then it can create organizational dysfunctionalities, board dysfunctionalities. And it's challenging because obviously the chair is a volunteer, and also because the board, and the board chair have to kind of balance this, sort of this both and of, both being in this oversight relationship to the CEO and also being supporters and, strategic, sounding boards and assets and, resources to the CEO. And so there's, it's a complex dance that has to happen, and and some of that is formalized and some not. But but my thinking on it at this point, and this is more just based in my own kind of experience and reading of kind of the board, what's been written about boards and so on, is that a lot of times there's we think about there's different types of leadership in the leadership literature, and there's empowering leadership is one form, and I see that as most the role of the chair as sort of first among equals, first among peers on a board, and and really a big part of the board chair's responsibility and role is to to help to shape the agenda, hopefully with input and dialogue from others. And to kind of ensure that the board goes about its work in both an efficient way, but also an inclusive way. And, in a way that draws on the knowledge and the insights that the board members have. And, the CEO is, as I see it, they're both plays an empowering role in relationship to the board, but also what's called transformational leadership. Which is kind of a sort of charismatic leadership, which is kind of, in some cases, kind of mislabeled because it's not always necessarily charisma in the sense of being extroverted and so on, but there can be quiet charisma too. But really, it's about bringing insight and information and and helping people to identify with the the goals of the organization and you know, and to motivate people to engage, really. And in the case of board members, you know, as volunteers, that motivational aspect is a critical piece. And you know, and so it's really about kind of, on the one hand, the CEO being sort of the, you know, kind of the link to the ground level of what the organization is doing, and really sort of how the decisions that the board makes have implications for both the staff and the beneficiaries and the donors, you know, in a very real kind of way. But at the same time, the board having its own sense of, you know, kind of independence from the CEO, which, you know, ideally the chair has helped to create by creating a, you know, kind of a container where, you know, in a space where people can have meaningful conversations and can bring what they have to offer. So, and, you know, and between the two of them, then they need to have, you know, some sort of, you know, sharing of those roles, because when, you know, if the chair is kind of checked out and is too passive, then, you know, you have a case where the CEO may be kind of rolling over the board, and then that then can often lead to the board being more disengaged, because, you know, and or can lead to the CEO getting too far out ahead of the board, either in a good way, you know, kind of beyond the board's intentions, or in a, you know, in the way of malfeasance, you know, if the board isn't really effective in minding the shop. And if the, you know, on the other hand, if the board is too engaged and over, you know, the line into the operations, then we have the, you know, the classic problem, the CEO feeling like the board is micromanaging them. And, you know, and so there, that, you know, that partnership between the chair and the CEO in order to manage that boundary is really important.
It really is a very delicate balance, isn't it?
Sorry,
it really is a very delicate balance, isn't it? Particularly the notion of, when you think about the notion of kind of first among equals, as you described, you know, really you're talking about peer setting, community leaders, you know, coming together to do, you know, important strategic work, but creating that environment, that peer environment, that partnership with the ED, where that's a safe place to do that and to test those boundaries. It really is kind of a delicate balance. I think many board chairs aren't necessarily prepared or don't necessarily appreciate the importance of that piece of the leadership role that they have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Talk to me about cognitively integrated behavior. What does that look like in a boardroom?
So, so in my research, I am, you know, I'm looking at, you know, really then the question, as I said, you know, we were talking about before, of how do you actually kind of integrate these different perspectives and different, you know, both knowledge bases and, you know, kind of relationship bases and, you know, and orientations in terms of the, you know, to come up with a decision for the board that's, you know, that takes all that into consideration. And in my research for that, I am drawing on some of the research that my dissertation chair has been doing and others in that field, but particularly around team effectiveness, because one of the things I'm doing in my research is really, you know, as we talked before about, you know, kind of looking inside the black box of the board and looking inside the black box of kind of board members' heads, you know, is to kind of, because there's not a lot of research in that arena, what I'm doing is kind of translating research on teams into the board context, because really the board is ultimately nothing more than a team if you think about it. You know, it's a group of individuals who are coming together around a shared function and goal and are interdependent with one another, you know, in order to accomplish that goal. And so, you know, and so what, you know, what I'm looking at is then, okay, so how do you then integrate this? And so this is a body of research that's been, you know, is just developing, but it's been kind of moving very quickly around how do teams do that? And particularly, for example, my pair has been doing this research around interdisciplinary science and medicine. And so when you have a team of clinicians and scientific researchers, and then people who are kind of in the space in between, and sort of translational medicine experts and so on, how do they come together and and create ways of both translating basic research into clinical practice and using clinical practice to inform research. And so so what they've found is that there's both a set of socially integrated behaviors that are helpful, and then a set of cognitively integrated behaviors. And so the socially integrated behaviors kind of create the the conditions that then help to support people in kind of doing the cognitive integration. And so things like in the socially integrated arena are things like visioning, and so having a clear sense of purpose and direction, and and objectives of the team, in our case the board. Having an environment where people can share, suggest ideas and share information. Having a connection, or having an environment where people can both seek out and help to facilitate connections among others in order to find common ground, and promoting coordination. And so, like, helping people who are kind of working on, say, like we've got 2 different subcommittees studying different aspects of a strategic decision, and making sure that they're coordinating and and talking to one another. Perspective seeking, and so kind of standing in the shoes of somebody else in order to better understand their perspective. And then reflexivity, which is basically the the board's capacity to look back on what we've done, and also look while we're in action and say, okay, so did we go about this in a good way? What are the kind of what are our pluses? What are our deltas? Kind of reflect on how we do our work together, and if we're doing the right work, if we're asking the right questions, in order then to be more conscious and aware. And so those socially integrated behaviors then help to kind of create an environment in the team where, or in the board, where both people have trust in one another, particularly in the competency of the other people in the group, and they have a sense of shared efficacy, which means that they believe that the board as a whole is capable of doing what it sets out to do and making the decision that's going to be good for the organization. And also an awareness of what's in psychological literature called transactive memory, but really it's about knowing who knows what. And so it's about kind of knowing what is the expertise, and not just sort of the stereotypical, the accountant has the accounting expertise, but really even life experience and insight and other things that that people bring to to the table, and so because the more that I know who around the table holds what knowledge and assets in that regard, the more I'm going to be able to look to them and to weigh what they have to say accordingly. And the flip side of that, of course, is know who doesn't know what, and so who doesn't have credibility on an issue, and weigh it accordingly. So, but then that creates the conditions for for cognitive integration, which is basically an internal process that people go through of which is in relationship, but it's a process of considering the perspectives and the insight and the input from others, and then either accommodating that information, and so fitting that information into to your existing kind of knowledge structure and perspective, or or assimilating that information and and shifting your own kind of way of looking at things. But either way, you're kind of taking in what other people have to say. And then transformation is when you're combining the knowledge and the insight of yourself and your other fellow board members into creating a product that's greater than the sum of parts. So so those three elements in particular are are really important to then reconciling those cognitive differences and values differences.
I'm watching our time. I don't want to hold you over too much longer, but could you describe the research methodology? How are you going to how are you going to conduct the research to provide the insights you need?
Sure. I'm still in the early stages, but designing this, and actually, I'm at this stage, I am kind of mapping out the the research literature and making the case through my literature review. For why, basically what I've been talking about, why this is important. But at this point, my initial thoughts are that I'm probably going to end up doing a survey, through hopefully through folks who are listening to this, and people who have connections to organizations and the boards of directors, and really kind of ask. On the one hand, ask folks, who in your board, give them a list of, after I get consent and, and sort of approval from the CEO and the chair, and hopefully they'll confer with the board, ask them, give them a list of people on their board and say, okay, so who do you look to as a leader in your board? And what I'm hoping to do is there's a methodology called social network analysis, which of the research on shared leadership has shown is probably the most robust way of looking at shared leadership. That it's not shared leadership, like I said, because it involves different people at different times in different ways. It's not just kind of the sum of like a lot of times that people are asked, okay, my board gives me direction on such and such, or my board inspires me. And it's really hard for people to kind of think in the aggregate. And so it's kind of a mushy concept. But if you say this person and this person and this person, I feel are, the ones who are inspirational, and this person, this person, this person are the ones that help us to set a clear direction, and so on. Then what you can start to do is look at not just sort of adding that up and say, okay, so how many people did that person check, which is the distribution, but then really what's the configuration of that? And is it that everybody named the same one person, or are people naming different people? And so it's more of rather than being kind of a starfish with a center and a bunch of arms that come out, you're actually more like a spider web. And there's a lot of connections and linkages and, kind of ways in which people influence one another. And so that's what I'm hoping to do. It's a little bit challenging methodologically because you've got to have, a very good percentage of the people on the board to respond. And, otherwise it can create serious gaps in the data, more so than just summing up the responses. But when that's feasible, it's a really powerful method. And plus it's a lot of fun to really, I think kind of be able to see visually when you draw out those connections, how are people actually relating to one another. And what I'm hoping to do is then translate that methodology also into my consulting work. And I've actually done that some with board assessments, where I've asked people, who do you look to for their expertise and insight, and have a social relationship with, things like that, that then can really help boards to look at, okay, so are we just like a center and periphery kind of board, and we've got a few people who are the kind of the decision makers, and then others who are marginal, or are we really more of a collective? And so so those are some of the things that I'm probably going to do, and it'll take shape a little bit more, but but that's my thinking at this stage.
Excellent. Well, obviously, we're going to have to bring you back for an update.
Definitely, especially once I have the results to talk about. That'll be a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Max. I just really I appreciate this chance to catch up and hear more about what you're up to these days. And really, I think that those who listen and who will be able to watch or hear the recording later will really grasp the importance of what you're going to be exploring. If you are interested in following Max, over on the right-hand side in the messages, I've provided his Twitter handle, also a link to the LF Leadership site, which includes a link to their blog. My Twitter handle is over here as well as my blog. Assuming that I don't completely blow the recording somehow, we will have access to some type of recording of this, so you can go back and listen to it again or watch it again and really absorb and think about what Max is describing. I know that I'm anxious to go back and re-listen when I don't have the moderator's hat on. Thank you
actually,
so much.
Before we close out, if you've got a few minutes, I'd love to see if anybody who's listening in has any questions or wants to chime in either by video or by text. I don't know that we had asked for any input along the way, but if you do have any questions that I can respond to, briefly, we can do that before we sign off. Thanks to Gwen for fascinating research. Thanks. I appreciate that.
And if you haven't already connected, you two need to get together and talk. Yes, you are kindred spirits from a governance perspective. Any questions, comments? Well, we'll have different ways. You can interact with Max on Twitter or his blog. At this point, I think we'll close it off. Thank you, Max. Thank you for being my brave first soul for this. I really am thinking that I'd like to bring on some other expert governance friends to talk about their work and bring it from a practitioner's perspective. Thank you for giving them a great model to follow.
Good. Well, thanks for inviting me.